The morning air over Buckingham Palace felt heavier than usual, thick with silence and the scent of rain-soaked stone. Guards exchanged uneasy glances while inside, the royal family gathered behind closed doors. King Charles sat at the head of a long mahogany table, the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. To his right, Prince William stood rigid, jaw clenched. Kate sat close by, holding young Charlotte, whose eyes darted around the room, sensing the tension even before words were spoken. Across from them sat Camilla, stripped of her jewels, her crown gone, but still clinging to the same steely pride that had once made her untouchable. No one could have predicted how far things would spiral from a few small acts of jealousy. It all began quietly, like a whisper drifting through the grand halls of Windsor Castle. Camilla had always been haunted by a fear she never spoke of, the fear of fading away. She watched the world adore William and Kate, praise their children, and idolize the memory of Diana. Every smile directed at George and Charlotte chipped away at her sense of belonging. She'd worked her whole life to be seen, yet the nation still called her the intruder. At first, her actions seemed harmless. A few quiet suggestions to the staff here, a mild complaint there. She told the children's nanny, Rebecca Lewis, to limit their time in the gardens with Charles. They need discipline, she said sweetly, though her eyes held a cold glimmer. They shouldn't be spoiled with attention. Rebecca had obeyed without question. After all, no one defied the queen consort. But soon, the instructions became more deliberate. George's writing lessons were canceled under the excuse of illness. Charlotte's charity events were postponed indefinitely. Even their education fund began to face technical delays. Every small decision was another thread in Camilla's quiet web. Charles noticed the changes but brushed them off. He believed his wife had grown softer over the years, that she'd buried her insecurities. But behind the gilded doors, a different truth was growing. One night, Camilla sat in her private chamber under the dim light of an antique lamp, flipping through Charles's old notebooks, his personal reflections written long before his coronation. When she read the line, "Camilla is my companion, not my love," something inside her cracked. The words echoed like a curse, reshaping her bitterness into vengeance. That very night, she contacted an old acquaintance, Philip Barlow, a disgraced royal press secretary who had once been dismissed after leaking photos to the tabloids. "I need a favor," she told him, "something small but powerful enough to remind the world that even kings hide secrets." Philip hesitated but couldn't resist the chance to crawl back into relevance. Within days, excerpts from the king's private journal were in the hands of international reporters. When the first headline appeared, "The King's Secret Fund Exposed," the palace descended into chaos. Newspapers worldwide questioned Charles's integrity. Late-night shows mocked his hidden diary. For the first time in years, Buckingham looked fragile. Camilla watched it all unfold from her sitting room, sipping tea, whispering to herself, "Now they'll remember me." But her satisfaction didn't last. The deception unraveled faster than she'd imagined. Forensic experts noticed discrepancies in the handwriting, subtle but undeniable. The press turned, asking who could have forged the diary. William suspected immediately. "Only two people knew the code that's safe," he told his father quietly, "you and her." When confronted, Camilla denied everything. Her eyes glistened not with guilt, but defiance. Yet the evidence spoke louder. Her fingerprints, her staff's accounts, and finally a trembling confession from Rebecca, all pointed in one direction. By the time the royal council assembled, even Charles couldn't bring himself to defend her. The verdict was swift. Her title stripped, her privileges revoked, her name erased from all royal duties. She would be sent to the Royal Reform Facility in Northland, a place meant for spiritual reflection and repentance. No guards, no cameras, no diamonds, just silence, humility, and orphan children to care for. As she was escorted out of Buckingham Palace, the portraits of past queens lined the walls like silent witnesses. Camilla paused for one last glance at the throne room. "You'll miss me," she murmured under her breath, though deep down she knew the kingdom already had not. The wind that swept across Northland carried a kind of chill only exile could bring. The Royal Reform Facility sat miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by misty hills and silence. The stone walls were cold, not cruel, built to humble, not to harm. Inside, Camilla wore a plain gray uniform and a silver pendant with no jewels, just the royal insignia carved faintly at its center. It wasn't luxury anymore, just a reminder of what she'd lost. Every morning, the bell rang at 6. She swept floors, folded sheets, and helped serve breakfast to children who had no idea the woman pouring their porridge once ruled England beside a king. At first, she refused to speak to anyone. When the children laughed, she turned away. When they cried, she called for another caretaker. Pride was her armor, and she wore it even when no one cared enough to notice. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. One afternoon, a small boy named Thomas followed her into the chapel garden. "Miss," he said softly, holding a wilted rose. "You dropped this." Camilla took it without looking at him. "It's just a flower," she said. "You can keep it." The boy smiled, his teeth slightly crooked. "Then I'll plant another one for you." She didn't know why those words stayed in her mind that night. Maybe because no one had given her something without expecting anything in return. For the first time, her dreams weren't filled with palaces or banquets, just the sound of rain and a boy planting roses in muddy soil. Meanwhile, back in London, the royal household was still recovering. The diary scandal had left deep scars. Public trust in the monarchy was shaken, and Charles grew quieter with every passing day. He spent his mornings in the palace gardens, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the marble statues that once symbolized strength. William, now shouldering more royal duties, moved with determination, but also a lingering ache. He hadn't wanted punishment for Camilla. Only the truth, yet the truth came with a price. His father's spirit had dimmed. Kate tried to restore warmth to the palace. She organized charity events, smiled through press interviews, and kept George and Charlotte shielded from gossip. But late at night, when the lights dimmed and the corridors echoed, even she admitted it, something sacred had broken in the royal bloodline. Far from all that noise, Camilla's days began to blur together. She found herself teaching the children to read fairy tales, though she often twisted the endings. "The queen doesn't always get her crown," she told them once, her voice half bitter, half wistful. "Sometimes she gets peace instead." The children didn't understand, but they liked her stories. She didn't know why she told them. Maybe to remind herself that she was still human. One evening, while cleaning the small library, she stumbled upon a tattered newspaper dated months earlier. The headline read, "King Charles Restores Education Fund for Young Royals." There was a photo beneath it, George smiling beside his grandfather. Camilla stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. It was then that the realization hit her like a quiet confession. She had tried to destroy something she secretly envied, pure, uncalculated love. The next morning, she didn't hide from the children's laughter. She helped Thomas and the others plant new flowers by the chapel wall. "These will bloom in spring," he said proudly. "They'll make the garden look royal." Camilla smiled faintly. "Royal things don't last forever, Thomas. But flowers? They always return." That night, when she looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her bed, she barely recognized herself. No crown, no court, just a tired woman with eyes softer than before. For the first time in her life, she didn't see a queen. She saw someone trying to become a person again. The morning sun filtered through the fog, painting gold over the gray walls of the monastery. The bells rang as usual, but there was a quiet warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. Camilla stepped into the garden with a basket of bread, her steps slower but steadier. The children were already awake, chasing one another across the damp grass. Thomas waved when he saw her, his small hands muddy from planting. "Miss Camilla, come see, the roses are growing." She smiled faintly, the corners of her eyes softening. "They're not roses yet, Thomas. They're promises." He laughed, not really understanding, and ran off again. For months now, her days had been stripped of ceremony and status. Yet within that simplicity, something rare had begun to grow: clarity. She had spent her entire life chasing validation, sculpting herself into an image fit for the crown. But standing among orphans who knew nothing of thrones or titles, she realized the irony. They were freer than she had ever been. Their affection was real, their laughter unfiltered, their forgiveness effortless. It was what the royal halls never gave her. One afternoon, the head sister handed her a sealed envelope with the royal insignia. "It came this morning," she said gently. Camilla stared at it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Charles's. The letter was brief. "I hope you are well. The children you tend will one day speak kindly of you." That is more lasting than any crown. I pray you find peace, for I have found mine." She folded the letter and pressed it to her chest, her eyes glistening but not breaking. It was the first time his words didn't feel like judgment, they felt like release. That evening, she gathered the children in the chapel. Candlelight flickered against the old stone walls as she told them a story. "Once, there was a queen who wanted everyone to love her," she began. "She wore the finest jewels and sat on the tallest throne, but no matter how hard she tried, her heart was always heavy. One day, she lost everything. And when she did, she discovered that love doesn't bow to crowns. It grows where kindness is planted." The children listened, eyes wide, unaware that the story was her confession disguised as a fairy tale. When she finished, Thomas tugged at her sleeve. "So, did the queen ever get her crown back?" Camilla smiled gently. She didn't need it anymore. As winter faded, word quietly spread across England that the former queen was serving selflessly at the Northland facility. News outlets published photos of her holding children, feeding them, laughing. Some called it redemption, others called it penance. The royal family remained silent, allowing the image to speak for itself. For the first time, the public didn't see scandal, they saw a woman who looked free. At Buckingham, Charles kept a small photo of Camilla in his study, one taken by a local photographer at the monastery. She stood in sunlight, hair tied back, surrounded by children. William once caught his father staring at it. "Do you ever think of visiting her?" he asked. Charles smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "No," he said softly. "Some peace can only exist apart." Back at Northland, spring arrived early. The roses Thomas planted bloomed in rich crimson. Camilla often sat beside them at dusk, a cup of tea warming her hands. She no longer thought about titles, press scandals, or the echo of palace halls. The world outside might still whisper her name with mixed emotions, but inside these walls she was simply Miss Camilla, the woman who read stories and taught kindness. One evening, as the children slept and the wind hummed through the chapel arches, she whispered into the quiet, "Maybe this was what the crown was always meant to teach me." The candle beside her flickered, its flame steady and soft. She closed her eyes, not as a queen stripped of power, but as a woman who had finally learned what power really meant, the power to forgive herself.